Hi everyone! In this video, I want to share my experience making a women's hanbok, the traditional Korean dress. I think hanbok is really cute and charming and I've always dreamed of having one, so I thought it would be a nice experience to make it by hand. So in this tutorial, I'll show you how to make skirt, top, underskirt and bag. I should mention I'm not a professional, I only sew occasionally. But I've tried to gather enough information to make a hanbok, and I want to share what I learned with you. Given all that, I tried to make this tutorial detailed, so it's easy for beginners to follow. So, shall we get started? Let's start off with the skirt. The hanbok skirt in Korean is called chima. I will make a pleated wrap skirt, which is the classic design. On top of my pleated skirt, I'll sew sheer organza overlay petals. That's what I call them for lack of a better word. I like this style and you'll probably see it most often in hanbok photos. In Korean, this style is called kallechima. As a side note, you can also often come across a modern interpretation of the hanbok skirt, mujigichima, where the skirt consists of multiple layers of chiffon or organza and again is covered on top with organza overlay petals. For the main fabric of the skirt, I was looking for a silky material. But you know, finding the right fabric took me a while because cheap polyester silky fabrics looked too shiny, which made them look kind of cheap, and fabrics made of real silk were pretty costly, as expected. But eventually I found a fabric in the color I needed, with an elegant sheen, made of 45% viscose and at a reasonable price, so I chose this one. I bought 3.5 meters. First, I measure out the length of the skirt along the fabric, making sure to include seam allowance at the bottom and at the top for attaching the waistband. Then I cut it out. I hem the side edges of the skirt. Each pleat of my skirt is 4 centimeters wide. I take my 2 centimeters wide ruler to fold the fabric into pleats, then stitch them straight away on the machine. I want to say that you can form the pleats with the fork, but it was wider than I wanted my pleats to be, so that's why I used the ruler instead. Since the fabric is heavy, I added an extra row of stitching slightly above the first one to secure the pleats better. Then I lightly press the pleats with an iron. For the organza overlays, I chose ivory organza with silver thread. It also took me a little while to find this fabric because I wanted it to look kind of gorgeous, not too shiny and sheer enough so the color of the base fabric could show through. And I want to say that I'm really happy with the one I ended up choosing. Just look at it! I'll be using 3 petals in the front, 3 in the back, and 1 for the wrap section. I should mention I haven't had much experience working with organza yet, and as you probably know, this one is quite a tricky fabric, and the one I got also frays a lot at the edges, so I figured I should try using a rolled hem presser foot. But even then, it didn't come out the way I imagined, so I just used it the way that worked for me. Now I pin the organza pleats onto the main fabric of the skirt and then sew them on the sewing machine. Next, we make the top part of the hanbok skirt, which is usually either a camisole-style top with straps, called chima chokki hori in Korean, or it can also be a wide waistband. Additionally, a separate waistband called hanbok horitji in Korean can be used on top. I chose the camisole style top since my skirt fabric is quite heavy and needs support on the shoulders. I drafted a pattern by looking at pictures online. The top part of my skirt will have two layers. The outer layer made from the same silky satin fabric as the skirt, and the inner layer made from simple white cotton. Using pins, I attached the inner layer to the outer layer with the right sides facing each other. I also want to point out that you need to insert the waistband straps at this step. These are what you'll use to tie the wrap skirt. I hand basted the pieces together. It turned out that I didn't have quite enough of the pink satin for the top, so the straps had to be made from several pieces. Then I cut along the outline and stitched it on the sewing machine. Now the hand basting thread is no longer needed. I turned the everything right side out and sewed the edges by hand. Next, I press it with the iron. I top stitch on the sewing machine, keeping the seam 2 to 3 millimeters from the edge. Finally, I removed the thread I sewed by hand. I sewed the pink top fabric to the skirt by hand. Then I sew it on the sewing machine. Next, I pinned the inner part of the top to the skirt and basted it by hand. On one side, I make a small buttonhole, and on the other side, I sew on a belt loop to keep the tie from slipping down. But these steps are optional. At this point, you should try the skirt on and decide on the final length of the skirt as well as the length of the organza overlays. They should be roughly the same length. I hem the edges by hand and then sew them on the sewing machine. Yay! The skirt's all finished! Now we are going to sew the top part of the hanbok, which is called chogori in Korean. I'm making a more classic version suitable for spring and autumn, and I wanted it to look elegant, so I went with the beige jacquard. My fabric also contains some percentage of natural fibers, which was important for me because I wanted to feel comfortable. And just as a side note, in modern interpretations, you'll also see tops made from organza, embroidered mesh, or thin satin. I'm starting with the standard pattern for the front, back, and sleeves. Let's start with the sleeve. I redraw the pattern in my size on paper and pin it to the fabric. I mark out the sleeve length I need, adding a 4 to 5 cm allowance at the bottom and trace the pattern. I also add a 1 cm seam allowance along the side seams and at the top of the sleeve. When transferring the pattern to the fabric, I pin it to show which side will attach to the front of the jacket and which to the back. Then I cut it out. To the standard pattern, I add the jacket's overlap and the front-facing piece, which I cut separately. I trace the pattern onto the fabric, adding 1 cm seam allowance all around and 3 to 4 cm hem allowance at the bottom, both for the front and the back. Here are my patterns for the front, the sleeve, and the back. I sewed the sleeve by hand first and then on the sewing machine. I want to mention that when I tried the sleeve on after sewing it, it felt a bit white at the bottom, so I narrowed it slightly. Then I finished the sleeve seam with an overlock stitch. Next, we hand sew the front facing onto the front, then machine stitch it and overlock the edges. We do the same for the side and shoulder seams of both the back and the front. Now we attach the sleeves. We align the pinned center marks of the sleeve with the front and back and sew them by hand first. Then we sew them on the sewing machine and overlock the edges. Now let's move on to the color. On my paper pattern, I marked the color length and width I wanted. For mine, the color will be 4.5 centimeters wide. For reference, the standard width is usually around 3 to 5 centimeters. I relied on photos I found online as references. Looking through handbook pictures, I noticed that colors can be attached in two ways, either along a straight line or along a curved one. I decided to go with the curved style. I transferred the color pattern from paper onto the fabric the same way I did for the other jacket pieces. The collar has two parts, an outer and an inner piece, each with a seam in the middle. Here you can see one piece pinned along the center seam, while the other is left open and reinforced with fusible interfacing using an iron. I stitched the center seam of both the outer and inner collar pieces with a 1 cm allowance and pressed it flat. Then I placed the two pieces right sides together, matching the center seams, and sew them, first by hand, then on the sewing machine. After that, I pressed the seam. Next, I turned the collar right side out and hand-stitched close to the edge, leaving about a 1 mm border from the outer side. The bottom edge I simply hand sew and then press again. I pin the middle of the collar to the center back and hand sew it along the neckline. Then I machine stitch it and finish the seam with an overlock. Next, I attach the facing to the front and to the collar with the sewing machine, turn it right side out and hand stitch it along the edge. I make sure to leave space for the ribbon that will be sewn in later. I also sew the collar along the back by hand and then press everything with an iron. Let's move on to the collar lining called tunjong. The ribbon is 12 cm wide. I fold it in half and press it flat. I hand sew the ribbon along the outer edge of the collar about 2 cm from the edge. You could also run it through the sewing machine if you want. Then I turn it inside out, sew it from the inner side by hand, and press it flat. A quick note: my ribbon starts about 7 cm from each end of the collar. Leave a 1.5 cm allowance so it can be folded neatly inwards. The collar is done. Now it's time to make the kurum, the ribbons that tie the jacket. I take 2 strips of fabric, each 8 cm wide. The width of ribbon itself will be 3 cm with 1 cm seam allowance on each side. My strips are 65 cm long, but the length can vary depending on the hanbok, usually between 60 and 90 cm. I also learned that in order to tie the ribbon correctly, the ribbon on the right side of the jacket should be slightly shorter than the one on the left. I sew the strips together, right sides facing in, and then turn them right side out. For this, I used a ruler with a rounded edge. Then I press it with iron. For the right side, I leave a gap equal to the width of the ribbon from the edge, and then sew on the second ribbon. After marking the hemline, I overlock the bottom edge, hem it by hand, and then sew it on the sewing machine. Since I didn't have enough fabric to hem the bottom of the sleeve, I added an extra piece, folded it under, and stitched it on the sewing machine 4 cm from the edge. And just like that, the top is done! Alright, let's move on to the underskirt, sokchima, an essential piece if you want your hanbok to look fabulous. For the underskirt, I bought white calico, 2.5 meters wide. This fabric holds its shape really well, and I wanted my skirt to be voluminous. It will be a gathered skirt with 2 side seams, a waistband, a ruffle at the bottom, and a zipper. I measured the length so it would fall just below the knee. Each piece of fabric is 1.5 meters wide, so the underskirt will be 3 meters wide in total. I finished the edges of the side seams first, then sew them together, leaving a space on the left side for the zipper. I pressed the seams. Next, I formed the gathers using a needle and thread, matching them to the width of my waist. I cut out the waistband and attached the underskirt to it by hand first. And then finish sewing it with the sewing machine. Now it's time for the zipper. I attach it by hand first. And then finish sewing it with the sewing machine. I press the waistband. Then I top stitch the waistband for a neat finish. Next, we make the ruffle, which is meant to add extra fullness to the skirt. It's optional, so you can skip it if you like. For the ruffle, I cut 3 pieces of fabric, each 1.5 meters wide and about 28 centimeters long. I formed the gathers by hand, attach it to the underskirt first by hand, and then finish sewing it with the sewing machine. And there we go! The underskirt is finished! And finally, we'll complete the look with the cute drawstring bag for the hanbok called pokchumoni. I'm going to make the bag from the same fabric as the main skirt, and I also cover it with the organza I used for the skirt's overlays. Some lining fabric is needed as well, so I chose white satin. I also decided to add a design to the bag, painting it with acrylic fabric paint. Actually, adding a design isn't necessary. You can simply make the bag plain or use printed fabric instead. So I make a paper pattern for the bag, 24 centimeters wide and 24 centimeters long. The bottom corners are slightly rounded and the top of the bag narrows by 2 centimeters. I pinned the main fabric together with the organza and transferred the pattern onto it using tailor's soap. I also transferred the pattern onto the lining fabric. I sewed the top pieces of the bag together, leaving a 2 cm opening about 1.5 cm from the top edge for inserting the drawstring later. I do the same with the pieces of lining, but here I also leave an extra 5 cm opening so I could turn the bag right side out later. I cut 2 pieces for the handles, each 9 cm wide and 30 cm long, press them 2 cm from the edges, fold them in half and press again. Then I top stitched the edges of the handles with the sewing machine. I attached the handles to the back by hand, making sure they are evenly spaced from the center, placing the main fabric and lining right sides together. Then I sewed them with the sewing machine. Now we turn the back right side out. Next, I hand stitch the top of the back, then go over it with the sewing machine and stitch another line 2 cm from the top edge. Now we should thread 2 drawstrings or ribbons through the openings left earlier, one in the front and one in the back. I made mine from the same fabric. And finally, I knot the drawstrings on the sides. Alright, we've finished all the handbook pieces, the skirt, top, underskirt, and back. Now let's check out the finished handbook. Thank you so much for watching and following along. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. So if you did, make sure to like this video and hit the subscribe button so you can join me for my next adventures. Wishing you a lovely day.